60,000 years ago, a group of humans stood at the edge of the known world and looked out across open water. No maps, no compass, no certainty that anything existed on the other side, and they went anyway, not by accident, not by drifting. They crossed some of the most treacherous ocean straits on Earth and reached a continent that no human being had ever set foot on, a place that would remain invisible to the rest of humanity for another 58,000 years. Scientists have known about this journey for decades. What they could not agree on was when it happened, how it happened, or which path these people took. Every theory had gaps. Every model left something unexplained. Then, a team of geneticists published findings that finally answered the question, and the answer was stranger than either side of the debate expected. I came across this study while looking into something else entirely. A new paper in Science Advances, led by a collaboration between the University of Huddersfield and the University of Southampton, analyzed mitochondrial DNA from nearly 2,500 people. The numbers alone were enough to make me stop scrolling. But when I read what they actually found, the routes, the timing, the implications, I spent the next 3 hours pulling every source I could find. Because this was not a minor adjustment to a timeline. This was a fundamental rethinking of how our species conquered the planet. Here is the core problem they were trying to solve. During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. Australia and New Guinea were joined as a single massive landmass called Sahul. To reach it from Southeast Asia, early humans had to cross a series of ocean channels, some of them over 90 kilometers wide, with no land visible on the other side. The question was not whether they did it. The archaeological record is clear on that. The question was when, and how, and from where. Two competing theories had divided the scientific community for years, and neither was willing to give ground. The long chronology argued that humans arrived around 60,000 years ago. Its proponents pointed to sites like Majed Baby in northern Australia, where stone tools and ochre pigments had been dated to roughly 65,000 years before present. The evidence was real, but the dating methods were contested. Critics argued the sediment layers might have been disturbed, pushing the apparent age backward. The short chronology countered with a later arrival, somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 years ago. This camp relied on the observation that most well-accepted archaeological sites in Australia cluster around this later window. Anything older, they argued, was noise. Both arguments had genuine evidence behind them. Neither had enough to close the case. And for years, the debate had settled into a slow stalemate, with each new paper shifting the needle by fractions, without ever moving it decisively in either direction. What neither camp had, until now, was a completely independent line of evidence, something that did not depend on stone tools, sediment layers, or the uncertainties of radiocarbon dating. Something written not in the ground, but in the bodies of the people themselves. The research team took a fundamentally different approach to the problem. Instead of digging into the Earth, they read the history recorded in mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed exclusively through the maternal line. Every person inherits it from their mother, who inherited it from hers, tracing an unbroken chain of mothers stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Because it mutates at a relatively predictable rate, it functions as a kind of molecular clock, accumulating small changes generation after generation that can be read backward to estimate when two populations diverged. The team assembled mitochondrial genomes from nearly 2,500 individuals, Aboriginal Australians, New Guineans, populations spanning all of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. They built a genetic family tree and traced how lineages had branched and spread between regions. Here is the detail that stopped me when I first read it. The oldest lineages, the ones found exclusively in Aboriginal Australians and New Guineans and nowhere else on Earth, dated to approximately 60,000 years ago. Not 50,000, not 45,000, 60,000. That figure does not come from contested sediment layers. It does not come from ambiguous stone tool assemblages. It comes from the bodies of living people carrying genetic signatures that have been accumulating changes for 60 millennia. The short chronology did not just weaken, it collapsed. but the timing was only half the revelation. The genetic data told a second story that nobody had fully anticipated. When the researchers traced where these ancient lineages originated in Southeast Asia, they did not find a single clean source. Most of the oldest lineages pointed to northern regions, the Philippines, northern Indonesia, areas closer to the equatorial stepping stones that would have led toward New Guinea. This was broadly expected. It matched the most commonly proposed migration corridor, but a significant and unmistakable portion of the lineages pointed somewhere else entirely. Southern Indonesia, Malaysia, Indochina, a completely different geographic origin, thousands of kilometers from the northern route. The conclusion was precise and startling. Early humans did not enter Sahul along a single migration corridor. They used at least two separate routes, both operating around the same time. Consider what that actually requires. This was not a single desperate crossing by one group who got lucky with the current. This was a coordinated, sustained expansion by multiple populations, traveling along independent pathways, navigating open water crossings that would challenge modern boats, and arriving at the same vast continent from different directions. These were not people stumbling into the unknown. These were seafarers, 60,000 years ago. Pull back from the genetic detail for a moment and consider what this actually implies about our species. 60,000 years ago, most of humanity was still concentrated in Africa and the Middle East. The people who would eventually become Europeans had not yet arrived in Europe. The people who would become East Asians were still somewhere along the migration route. Agriculture would not exist for another 50,000 years. Writing would not be invented for another 55,000. And yet, in Southeast Asia, groups of modern humans had already developed the navigational knowledge, the boat-building technology, and the social organization necessary to cross open ocean repeatedly along multiple routes, and successfully enough to establish permanent populations on the other side. This is not a minor point about chronology. It fundamentally challenges the way we think about early human capabilities. For decades, the prevailing assumption was that early Homo sapiens outside of Africa were relatively simple, driven more by instinct and environmental pressure than by deliberate planning. The Australian migration destroys that assumption. You do not cross 90 kilometers of open ocean by accident. You do not take multiple routes to the same destination without communication. You do not establish a permanent presence on a new continent without forethought, preparation, and a level of cultural complexity that leaves no physical trace in the archaeological record, but is now unmistakably visible in the DNA. Professor Helen Farr, who co-led the study, described it as reflecting the deep heritage of indigenous communities in the region and the extraordinary skills of these early voyagers. That is careful academic phrasing for something that deserves to be stated more directly. These were among the most accomplished navigators in human history, and they achieved what they achieved at a time when most of our species had not yet left its birth continent. The archaeological evidence reinforces this at every level. Rock art in northern Australia, among the oldest on Earth, depicts ocean-going animals and coastal environments that suggest intimate familiarity with the sea. Tool assemblages from the earliest Australian sites show regional variation, different groups adapting to different environments, consistent with a multi-route arrival rather than a single point of entry. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describe creation journeys across water, ancestral beings arriving from the sea, landscapes transformed by the first people to walk them. Scientists have increasingly recognized that some of these traditions encode genuine historical memory, stretching back thousands, potentially tens of thousands of years. The DNA evidence and the cultural evidence are pointing in the same direction, corroborating each other from completely independent categories of knowledge. And Professor Richards himself noted that this is not the end of the story. His team is currently analyzing hundreds of whole human genome sequences, 3 billion base pairs each, compared to the 16,000 in mitochondrial DNA, to test these results against thousands of additional lines of descent. Future archaeological discoveries and potentially ancient DNA recovered from key remains could provide even more direct confirmation. Here is the thing that stays with me after spending days inside this research. We are taught to think of human history as a progression, simple to complex, primitive to advanced. Stone tools, then agriculture, then cities, then civilization. As if capability accumulated slowly and evenly like sediment. This study says otherwise. 60,000 years ago, before agriculture, before writing, before any of the things we associate with advanced civilization, human beings looked at open ocean and made a decision. Multiple groups, multiple routes, deliberate, sustained, successful. The people who accomplished this left no written records. They built no monuments that survived. The boats they used rotted away millennia before anyone thought to preserve them. The only testimony they left was biological, encoded in the mitochondrial DNA of their descendants, passed from mother to daughter to daughter to daughter across 3,000 generations. And that testimony, when scientists finally learned to read it, did not tell a story of accident or desperation. It told a story of capability so far beyond what we assumed that it forces a recalibration of everything we thought we knew about early human potential. The first Australians were not refugees washed ashore by a favorable current. They were the greatest navigators their world had ever seen. And 60,000 years later, their DNA is still telling their story, still arriving on new shores, still reaching places no one expected it to go.